I swear something felt off that morning. The air was heavy, like a storm was coming, even though the sky outside was clear. The Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, its tired old ornaments reflecting the glow of the fireplace. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the room, the kind of smell that should have felt comforting. But beneath all that warmth, there was a chill I couldn't shake, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Then came the moment I was waiting for. My mother, dressed in her ridiculous red velvet robe, held out a small box wrapped in gold foil. Her eyes gleamed with pride as she turned to my younger sister, Lucy. Lucy gasped before she even touched it. "Oh my God," she shrieked, already performing. She peeled back the paper with dramatic precision, like she was on some holiday commercial. Inside the box was a single silver key, nestled in a plush velvet lining. Lucy's eyes widened as if she'd just been handed the deed to a kingdom. And in a way, she had. "We bought her a house," my mother announced, her voice thick with emotion, as if she had just declared world peace instead of blatant favoritism. My father nodded beside her, solemn, as if this was some sacred family rite. Lucy shrieked again, launching herself into their arms, sobbing out thank yous like she had just won the lottery. I just sat there, hands resting on a thin, unimpressive envelope that had been placed on my lap moments before. No grand gesture, no excited announcement, just a quiet "here" from Dad, as if he was handing me a bill. My fingers traced the edges of the envelope as I watched the spectacle unfold. This wasn't new. Birthday after birthday, holiday after holiday, Lucy got the big gifts, the celebrations, the over-the-top displays of love. And me, I got whatever this was. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. My heartbeat pounded as I scanned the words. I didn't react right away, just stared at it. Then, slowly, I lifted my gaze to my father. "Aren't you going to open it?" he asked, casual, oblivious. I held up the paper so he could see. For a split second, something flickered in his expression: confusion, then realization. The smugness cracked, but only for a moment. "You'll understand someday," Mom said softly, her voice dripping with that same condescending pity she always used on me. But she was wrong. I already understood. This wasn't an accident. This was the way things always were. A cycle that had repeated itself my entire life. Lucy, the golden child. Me, the afterthought. But not anymore. I forced a smile, not because I was happy, but because I had learned that sometimes silence is the best weapon. I tucked the paper back into the envelope and nodded, as if everything made perfect sense, because for the first time it did. They thought they had given me nothing, but what they had really given me was clarity. And soon, they were going to regret that more than anything. I didn't open the envelope again after that. I didn't need to. The weight of it was enough. Christmas morning continued around me. The same script as always. Lucy paraded her key around, already planning furniture layouts and paint colors while my parents basked in the glow of her excitement. I sat quietly, sipping my coffee, pretending not to notice when they didn't ask me about my gift. When the presents were done, Mom got up to start breakfast. Dad went to refill his coffee. Lucy plopped down on the couch beside me, still holding the key between her fingers, letting the metal catch the light. "You should come see it sometime," she said, voice syrupy sweet. I turned to her, finally breaking my silence. "See what?" "My house," she beamed. "I mean, it's technically not mine yet, but Mom and Dad said the paperwork should be finalized next week. It's so cute, 3 bedrooms, big windows, a little backyard. Oh, and it's in that new development near the lake." Of course, it was. That neighborhood was full of polished driveways and overpriced boutiques, the kind of place my parents always dreamed their perfect daughter would end up. I nodded. "Sounds nice," she grinned. "And it'll be so much easier for family gatherings now. You know, since I'll have the space. Maybe Thanksgiving next year?" A small laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Not because anything was funny, but because of how easy it was for her. How effortlessly she assumed that I would always be the guest. Lucy tilted her head, confused. "What?" "Nothing." I stood up, stretching. I should help Mom with breakfast. I left her there, still holding that key like it was the most precious thing in the world. Later that afternoon, I slipped away while they were all distracted. The cold bit at my skin as I stepped outside, but I welcomed it. It was better than sitting in that house for another second, pretending. I walked down the driveway, past my dad's meticulously trimmed hedges, and down the street. My car was parked a few houses away. I always did that when I visited. An old habit from when I was younger, when I used to fantasize about getting up and leaving in the middle of dinner. I slid into the driver's seat and finally let myself breathe. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, untouched since the morning. I picked it up, weighing it in my hands, then carefully pulled the paper out again. It was a deed transfer, not to a house, not to anything of value, just a plot of land, an empty stretch of dirt out in the middle of nowhere. I let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head. It wasn't even an insult at this point. It was a joke. A cruel, calculated joke wrapped up in a neat little legal document. They had given Lucy a home, a place to build a life, and they had given me nothing but land that no one wanted. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into the envelope, placing it on the dashboard. Then, for the first time in my life, I stopped feeling small. They had made a mistake. They thought they had won, but they had just handed me my opening move. I spent the next few days researching. The land they had given me wasn't just some forgotten plot in the middle of nowhere. It was tied to a development deal one that had been stalled for months due to zoning restrictions and some legal complications. And the best part, it was directly connected to the neighborhood where Lucy's house was. I sat at my desk, poring over records, permits, and legal loopholes. I wasn't an expert, but I knew how to dig. I knew how to find cracks in the foundation. My parents had made a mistake thinking I wouldn't notice, a bigger mistake assuming I wouldn't use it. Because if they thought they could push me aside again, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The more I dug, the more it became clear this wasn't just some random piece of land my parents had thrown at me as an afterthought. It was a mistake they never intended me to understand. The land wasn't worthless, not even close. It was a critical piece of property, one that developers had been fighting over for months. The only thing holding up construction was zoning approval. And the best part, the minute the city approved the project, that empty stretch of dirt would be worth more than my parents' entire house. I stared at the records spread across my desk, my heartbeat slow and steady. They had handed me the one thing they never would have given me if they had actually done their research: power. Now it was just a matter of using it. I spent the next few weeks quietly making calls. A lawyer friend, a city zoning official, a contact I knew from an old job who had worked on similar developments. I didn't ask for favors, I asked for information. The land was caught in legal limbo. The developers were still pushing, but the process was slow, tangled in red tape. But if someone owned the land and had the right leverage, they could decide exactly what happened to it. So I got to work. I filed the necessary paperwork, transferred everything fully into my name, and started preparing for what came next. The thing about my family, they only paid attention when something directly affected them, and they were about to pay attention. A few months later, I was sitting at my kitchen table when I got the call. Hey, it was Lucy, sounding confused. Weird question, but did Mom and Dad give you some land for Christmas? I smiled to myself, leaning back in my chair. Yeah. Why? Well, she hesitated. I just got off the phone with Mom. She's freaking out. Apparently, some developer sent them a notice about zoning issues for my neighborhood. Something about a hold on new construction because of an adjoining property. I let the silence stretch, waiting for her to get there on her own. Then, wait. It's your land, isn't it? Bingo. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city, my fingers tapping lightly against the windowsill. You know, I said finally, it's funny how things work out. Lucy was quiet. Then she sighed, her voice dropping to something closer to irritation. Okay, so what does this mean? Are you, selling it? I could almost hear our parents in the background, whispering, planning, already trying to figure out how to fix their mistake. I let my voice go light, casual. I haven't decided yet. Lucy groaned. Come on, you don't even want the land, right? You can just sell it and be done with it. Oh, Lucy. I wasn't going to sell it, not yet, because this wasn't just about money. This was about making sure they finally understood. I had spent my entire life being pushed aside, treated like an afterthought. They had written me off as the daughter who would never fight back, who would always accept whatever scraps they threw my way. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated me. And now they were going to learn. Lucy called again the next day. Okay, so, Mom and Dad want to talk. Of course, they did. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through an email from a developer who had expressed interest in the land. I let Lucy's words hang in the air, giving her enough silence to get uncomfortable. She sighed. Can you just stop being difficult and meet with them? I smiled at the word difficult. That was how they always framed it, wasn't it? Anytime I set a boundary, anytime I refused to play my role, I was being difficult. I don't have anything to say to them. Lucy groaned. You're being petty, am I? I leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. They gave me the land. It's mine now. I'm just deciding what to do with it. Yeah, but you know what you're doing, she snapped. And there it was. I had spent my entire life watching her get everything handed to her. The attention, the praise, the house. And now, for the first time, I had something she wanted, something she needed, and she hated it. I checked my watch, suddenly bored. I'll think about it. Lucy made an irritated noise, but before she could say anything else, I hung up. A week passed before I finally agreed to meet. Not at my parents' house. Not on their terms. I picked a neutral spot, a quiet little cafe on the other side of town, far from the carefully curated image of their suburban perfection. When I arrived, they were already there, seated at a corner table. My mother was stirring her tea with slow, deliberate movements, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father sat beside her, arms crossed, a deep furrow between his brows. I took my time walking over, sat down without a word. Mom was the first to speak. We need to talk about the land. I lifted an eyebrow. What about it? She exhaled sharply. You know what about? I shrugged. I just assumed it wasn't important, considering the way it was given to me. Dad's jaw tightened. Look, we didn't know the land would turn into. He cut himself off, shaking his head. That's not the point. The point is, it's causing issues with Lucy's neighborhood. Mom nodded. You should sell it to the developers. It's the reasonable thing to do. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. Reasonable for who? They exchanged glances. We didn't mean to, Mom started, but I cut her off. You did exactly what you meant to do. You gave me something you thought was worthless. You handed Lucy a house and me a piece of land you assumed had no value. Mom's lips thinned. That's not fair. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not fair? I repeated, shaking my head. No. What's not fair is spending my entire life being treated like a footnote in my own family. What's not fair is watching you hand Lucy everything, while acting like I should just be grateful for whatever scraps you decide to throw my way. Dad's eyes darkened. You're blowing this out of proportion. Am I? I leaned forward, voice calm, steady. Because it seems to me that for the first time, I have something you want. And suddenly, you care about fairness. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then Mom did what she always did. She softened her voice, tilted her head slightly, played the role of the loving, concerned mother. Sweetheart, we just want what's best for everyone. I smiled. So do I. Then I stood up, pushed my chair back with deliberate slowness, and walked out. Let them sit in it. Let them finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, because I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The first call came the next morning. Mom. I let it go to voicemail. The second came an hour later. Dad. Ignored that one too. By lunchtime, Lucy had sent me 3 texts, each more frantic than the last. Lucy, are you seriously ignoring us? Lucy, this is getting ridiculous. Lucy, just sell the land and be done with it. I smiled at my phone, shaking my head. Sell the land? Oh, I was going to do something much better than that. That afternoon, I met with the lead developer. He was a middle-aged guy named Carl, sharp-eyed and businesslike, the kind of man who had built his career on squeezing every ounce of profit out of people who didn't know their own worth. Unfortunately for Carl, I did. I'll be honest, he said, flipping through some papers. We were planning to buy that land for about 30 grand before your parents transferred it to you. I let that number hang between us for a moment. 30 grand. That was what they thought I was worth. I smiled. It's not for sale. Carl blinked. Not at all? Nope. I leaned back, crossing my arms. But I do have a proposal. He raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I slid a file across the table. You're not just building houses, you're building a community, right? A high-end, exclusive neighborhood. Carl nodded. Then you're going to need something special to attract buyers, I continued. Something unique. And lucky for you, I have the perfect piece of land for that. His interest was piqued now. What are you suggesting? A park, I said simply. Or better yet, a private clubhouse. Something exclusive to the neighborhood. Carl glanced down at the file, flipping through the zoning details I had compiled. I had spent weeks researching, finding the perfect leverage point. See, the development was missing something. A community space, the kind of thing that boosted property values and made houses sell faster. And I just so happened to own the only available land that could legally be used for it. Carl exhaled, rubbing his chin. This could actually work. It could, I agreed, and I'd be happy to lease the land to you for a generous monthly sum. His gaze snapped back to me. Lease? I nodded, smiling. That way, I keep ownership. You get your clubhouse, and my family gets to watch as the land they tried to throw away turns into something they'll never be able to touch. Carl chuckled, shaking his head. Cold. I shrugged. Just business. He leaned back, studying me. You're smarter than your parents. You know that? I already knew. I extended my hand. So, do we have a deal? Carl grinned and shook it. We have a deal. By the time the paperwork was finalized, my parents were desperate. The moment they heard about the clubhouse, they knew they had lost. Lucy wouldn't be able to host her picture-perfect gatherings. She wouldn't be the center of attention at every neighborhood event, because I had built something bigger, something permanent. And it was mine. The last time I saw them, it was at a family gathering, one of those forced events where everyone pretended everything was fine. Lucy wouldn't look me in the eye. Mom kept forcing a tight-lipped smile. Dad barely spoke. And me? I enjoyed every second of it. Because for the first time, I wasn't the forgotten one. I wasn't the afterthought. I was the one thing they could never ignore. And that was better than revenge. That was justice. A few months passed, and the clubhouse project moved forward smoothly. The construction crew broke ground, and the developers made their big announcement. The neighborhood was buzzing with excitement after all. An exclusive private clubhouse wasn't just an amenity, it was a status symbol. And my parents? They didn't say a word. Not to me, at least. Lucy, however, cracked first. She called one evening, her voice tight with frustration. You really won't sell it? I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights from my window. Nope. It's just a clubhouse, she snapped. Why are you being so? I could practically hear her biting back the word difficult. I smirked. So what, Lucy? Stubborn? Selfish? She exhaled sharply. Mom and Dad are upset. They'll live. She let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, but they don't get it. They think you did all this just to screw them over. I smiled. Then they understand perfectly. Lucy groaned. God, do you even hear yourself? You're proving their point. You're just... I cut her off. Just what? She hesitated. And in that silence, I heard the truth. I wasn't the forgotten one anymore. I was the one calling the shots. And they hated it. The clubhouse opened in the spring. I made sure my name was on the plaque out front, right beneath the words, "Land donated," by a small, subtle detail that would outlive any of their resentment. When I visited for the first time, I walked through the grand entrance, past the polished marble floors and expensive lighting. Everything about it screamed prestige, exclusivity, and the best part? It was mine. Not to own, but to control, to decide who had access, who got invited, who was allowed past those gleaming doors. I ran my fingers along the smooth edge of the welcome desk, my lips curling. Lucy would never host her picture-perfect holiday dinners here. My parents would never proudly introduce it as part of the family legacy, because they had thrown me aside, and I had built something they could never take back. At the next family gathering, no one brought it up. They all knew better by now. Mom forced a smile. Dad made strained small talk. Lucy acted like everything was normal. But there was a tension in the air, a quiet, unspoken understanding that the balance had shifted. I wasn't an afterthought anymore. I wasn't small. And I wasn't invisible. I had taken everything they tried to discard and turned it into something untouchable. And that was better than revenge. That was power. Story 2. I can't recall a single instance in my early years when I wasn't informed, either directly or indirectly, that my sister Rebecca would always come first, and that her needs, hardships, and failures would always take precedence. over anything else. I wished that I had been given the position of second in the family from the time of her birth. The events did not occur simultaneously. Didn't a significant betrayal cause everything to fall into place? My parents never sat me down and told me directly that I would always pursue her throughout any of our conversations. It shaped my perception of my own value in their eyes over the years, more like a steady, relentless drip of 1,000 little moments. I was supposed to tell Rebecca everything when we were little. She doesn't comprehend because, as my parents say, she's younger, not because it was fair or because she didn't have enough. I was taught to be the larger person if she smashed one of my toys, if she lost her temper because she sought something that belonged to me. You know how she gets? My mom would sigh and say, "Come on, Lisa, simply give it to her." It began with minor things that, at the time, didn't seem to matter. However, that pattern remained constant as we grew older and our lives transitioned from playdates and toys to obligations and expectations. It only got worse. I obtained my first job when I was 16 years old. I had no other option, not because I wanted to work or because I was excited to begin accumulating money for the future. Early on, my parents had made it plain that I would have to work for anything more than the necessities. To gain some degree of independence, I worked on the weekends, took jobs after school, and saved every penny I could. However, Rebecca was exempt from working when she reached 16. I was spared the need to save. My parents bought her a vehicle, gave her a credit card, and encouraged her to concentrate just on her studies, so I didn't have to worry about anything. In order to pay for tuition and living expenses when I started college, I sought for scholarships, took out loans, and worked 2 part-time jobs. I was aware that nobody would help me if I couldn't solve it on my own. Rebecca, meantime, attended a pricey institution that my parents paid for in full, lived in a lovely off-campus apartment that they paid for completely, and never had to worry about a single expense. Because, in my mother's words, your Lisa is stronger than Rebecca. She requires further assistance. The justification was always that. The rationale, the justification for each decision they made. The unwavering conviction that I could manage it and didn't require as much, that Rebecca needed to be protected at all costs because she was weak, sensitive, and unable to face reality. I battled, but that didn't matter. I was tired, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter that she lived worry-free for years while I felt like I was barely making ends meet. I was on my own because I was capable. It was so embedded in me by the time we were grown-ups that I no longer questioned it. Hello, everyone. I apologize for disturbing your viewing, but kindly like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. I gave up expecting them to ever regard me as someone in need of basic respect, care, or attention, and I stopped wishing for anything different. My parents paid for Rebecca's vehicle accident when she was unable to pay her rent. When she accrued credit card debt by purchasing unnecessary items, they replaced it. They didn't hesitate to pay it off. And my mother groaned when I was having trouble paying for a hospital bill following an unforeseen incident. She remarked, "I wish we could help, honey, but things are tight right now. You'll figure it out, I'm sure." I had long come to terms with the fact that Rebecca would always be their first priority, and that regardless of my accomplishments, level of responsibility, or numerous instances of proving my value, I would never be the child they were concerned about, the one for whom they gave their lives, the person they shielded. However, nothing could have prepared me for this moment, even after years of knowing exactly where I stood and a lifetime of being marginalized. I understood they had never respected me at all when they informed me they were stealing from me on my wedding day, looked me in the eyes, and grinned as if they were doing me a favor. I made the decision to stop allowing them to take from me at that same moment. When your brother has everything handed to them, have you ever had to struggle for scraps? Because I was never going to allow that to happen again. In hindsight, I should have anticipated it, ought to have seen the subtle clues. I should have understood that my parents would never allow me to enjoy this one moment without somehow turning it into a story about Rebecca, without turning it into something that would benefit them at my expense, and without finding a way to remind me that I was only an afterthought in their eyes. However, at the time, I was so engrossed in the anticipation of being married that I paid too much attention to the wedding specifics, the incessant to-do lists, seating charts, and last-minute decisions that I disregarded together with the warning signs that were almost shouting at me, overwhelmed me. It began quietly. My mother would say innocuous things like weddings are expensive, times are tough, and it's a shame people feel the need to spend so much on just one day. She would also sigh and pause dramatically anytime the topic of money was brought up, to remind me that she didn't like anything that wasn't focused on her needs or wishes. I initially assumed she was simply being her typical self and finding a way to add her viewpoint to something unrelated to her passive-aggressive comments. However, my father then began to do it too carelessly, saying that things weren't as simple as they once were and that they had recently been under a lot of financial difficulty. Because in order to support Rebecca, they had been giving up certain things. Of course, Rebecca was pouting from the start as well. She was acting as though my wedding was a personal assault, as if my enjoyment were a bother, as though I were somehow robbing her of something by choosing to celebrate my love for Matt. She sneered whenever my bridesmaids discussed their outfits, rolled her eyes anytime someone mentioned the wedding, and made small digs about how absurd it was to spend so much money on a single day. The barely disguised animosity anytime someone focused on me rather than her, however, was the worst aspect and the thing that made my blood boil. They had always revolved around her. They had always concerned about her, and they had always rescued her from whatever mess she had made. And she was no longer the protagonist for the first time. I was the one being celebrated for once, the one that everyone was worrying about, the one that everyone was anticipating, and Rebecca couldn't take it. Matt was immediately aware of everything. He heard every force, saw every pointed stare, heard every whispered discussion, and sensed the tension. My mother sighed, and as soon as we were alone ourselves, he called it out there and said he was going to pull something. He watched me reorganize the seating plan for the millionth time, his face inscrutable, his words stern yet calm. I stopped, frowning a little as I looked up at him. "Who? Your folks?" Without hesitation, he crossed his arms across his chest and put down his glass of water. "They'll be up to something nefarious. I can sense it, but I'm not sure what it is yet." I shook my head, forced a little giggle, and exhaled because I knew that even they wouldn't go to that far. I rolled my eyes and mumbled, "Come on, Matt," attempting to suppress the shaky feeling that was beginning to crawl up my back. I understand that they may seem self-centered, but this is my wedding. My wedding wouldn't be ruined by them either. Matt was not smiling, didn't appear comforted, refused to give up. Rather, he simply observed me for a considerable amount of time before letting out a leisurely breath and massaging his jaw. Finally, he added, "You give them too much credit." He now spoke in a lower, more measured and cautious tone. "To show that they don't see you the way they see Rebecca, they have spent your whole life demonstrating that she comes first. And they're plotting something, Lisa, I'm telling you." I wanted to argue. I wanted to correct him, tell him that he was being overly suspicious, and explain that although my parents weren't perfect, they weren't bad people, that they were limited as well, that not even they would use a sacred event like my wedding as a means of further favoring Rebecca. However, I knew he was correct deep down, somewhere in the part of me that had been ignored, told to understand, and pushed aside for years. I simply didn't want to acknowledge it. Therefore, I persuaded myself that he was exaggerating and that we were simply anxious that after the wedding, we would laugh about this, how paranoid we had been, and how absurd it was to believe they would act in such a self-centered manner. But when Matt took an envelope out of his jacket pocket and gave it to me with a knowing glance, just in case he wasn't laughing, simply he said, his confidence was unwavering and his voice was steady, and I should have known at that very moment. It should have been obvious to me that Matt was 3 steps ahead of them, and that he was ready for whatever they had planned. The wedding was flawless, perfect in every way that was important. It was full of warmth, laughter, and the kind of unwavering love that encircled me like a shield and gave me the brief impression that nothing could harm me, that this could not be ruined by anything. That I was at the center of something positive for the first time in my life. The ceremony had been beautiful, the vows heartfelt, the reception buzzing with joy, the air thick with the scent of fresh flowers, expensive champagne, and the promise of a future that belonged entirely to Matt and me. I had spent the entire day floating, smiling so much my cheeks hurt, gripping Matt's hand like a lifeline, feeling the type of happiness I had always assumed was solely meant for other people, people whose family didn't consider them as an afterthought. People who didn't spend their entire lives vying for the slightest bits of affection. And for the first time in years, I let myself really think that maybe, just maybe, my parents had finally decided to be normal for once, that they had chosen to leave their bias aside, that they had recognized, even if just for a day, that this was meant to be about me. They had smiled in all the photographs, cheered at the toasts, made nice talk with Matt's family, dancing like they were pleased parents, like they genuinely saw me, like I was worth anything more than simply a financial backup plan or an obligation they had never desired for hours. I let myself dive into that delusion, allowed myself imagine that all of the bitterness, all of the favoritism, all of the years of being regarded as second best didn't matter anymore. That maybe, just maybe, this was the tipping point where everything changed. And then my mother grabbed me aside, her face stretched into a dazzling, almost too flawless smile, her eyes shining like she was ready to offer me a gift instead of take anything from me. She took my hands in hers, squeezed them softly, leaned in like she was ready to share something significant, something profound, something personal. Then she delivered the words that would make all the difference, in the nicest, softest voice she had ever used with me. Your donated money will be retained. Rebecca is more in need of it than you are. For a moment, I believed that I had misheard her, that perhaps the words had been jumbled in my mind. I wondered whether I was still in the wedding's surreal haze. The absurd optimism that they had finally decided to prioritize me was still blinding me, and I was still immersed in the warmth of the day. However, the longer I stood there looking at her, the more I waited for the joke, the explanation, or any sign that she wasn't being sincere. My fingers went numb in her hands as my body grew colder and my blood turned to ice. She continued to smile as if she hadn't just torn the earth from beneath me, as if she hadn't just broken the last shaky strand of faith I had in her, as if she truly believed she was helping me. Even though my throat felt like it was shutting, I forced my lips to move, my voice to operate, and the words out. What? She let out a sigh, as though this was something that drained her, as if I were being challenging, as if I weren't instantly concurring with her predetermined course of action. You don't need it, darling, I said. She said, the way you talk to a youngster who doesn't comprehend why they can't have what they want is polite and compassionate. Now that you have Matt, Rebecca is having difficulties. It's only right that she get some assistance. With my whole body rigid and my heart thumping so intensely that I could feel it in my fingertips, I gazed at her. As I forced myself to remain composed, breathe, and not cause a scene at my own wedding, my fingernails dug into my palms. You can't accept that money. At last, I spoke in a tight, clipped voice. It was nothing like the tender, emotional moment she had obviously been anticipating. As though the thought of my saying no was so alien and unimaginable that she hadn't even prepared for it. My mother blinked in amazement, as though it hadn't ever occurred to her that I may not accept this. Lisa, her voice, which Mom usually used when I didn't quickly follow her lead, dipped into disappointed contempt as she spoke. Your folks are where? Your life is going well now. A future. A husband. Rebecca, I said. I don't care about Rebecca, sounding rougher than I meant to, but I didn't feel bad about it. Didn't retract them. Didn't make them softer the way I was supposed to. I was handed the money. It's not your place to touch it. At that moment, her smile faltered. Her face was losing a little of its charm. Her voice cooled just enough for me to glimpse the reality underneath the warmth. Still acting as though she wasn't doing something profoundly, tragically wrong, she shook her head and muttered, "Oh, sweetheart." Her voice was still brimming with phony worry. It's family, and we support one another in our family. At that point, I realized that this was not just another instance of them showing preference for Rebecca, nor was it only a reminder that I would always come second. No, this was the clearest evidence that they had never once considered me to be an individual with limits, someone who was worthy of even the most basic respect, or someone who was my own person. And before I could even comprehend the treachery, before I could even start to think about how to react, before I could even absorb it, a quick, piercing chuckle came from behind me, and I felt it sit heavily in my chest. As I turned, I saw Matt shake his head, looking pleased, almost delighted, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. He extracted an envelope from his jacket pocket, and held it between two fingers as if it were a winning hand in a game. My parents were not even aware they were playing. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he spoke the words that would alter everything. Fortunately, we prepared for this. I knew that this was the moment when everything changed, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on the type of quiet that crackled with something sharp, something ready to burst, something that made me shudder. My mother was still grinning, still clinging to what little confidence she had left, and still staring at me as if I were meant to just nod and take it, as if I were supposed to give her my wedding present money and express my gratitude for the opportunity to give it to Rebecca. My father was standing behind her with his arms folded and his face impassive, but I could see the same calm assurance in his eyes, that same unwavering conviction that they had already prevailed and made up their minds what would happen, because there was nothing I could do about it. Then Matt chuckled. It was not a clumsy chuckle. Wasn't it the apprehensive giggle individuals make when they're unsure of how to respond? It was amused, steady, and serene. It wasn't the type of chuckle that befitted a situation like this, and it sent a chill through the crowd. My mother's eyes flicked toward Matt, as if she had suddenly realized that he had been silent for too long, and that he had been watching things develop with too much patience, and her fingers twitched over mine as her grin faded just a little. That perhaps, just possibly, he was more difficult to control than she had thought. Matt said, "Good thing we planned for this." His voice was silky smooth, and his unwavering confidence made my mother tense. Her hands tightened slightly, and her body went completely still as if she had just stepped into a trap she hadn't seen coming. He didn't reach into his jacket pocket, and his movements were deliberate and controlled, as if he had been waiting for this very moment to come. He produced a plain white envelope that had the capacity to destroy everything despite its innocent appearance. My parents believed they were aware of the circumstances. He tilted it slightly while holding it between two fingers and observed them with a clear-cut look of delight. They were unaware of what was about to happen. My mother stared between the envelope and Matt, attempting to put together what was going on. Her lips slightly parted as she blinked, her face flashing with perplexity, attempting to understand why he appeared so very confident. She was trying to figure out why things weren't turning out the way she had hoped. "What is that?" Her voice was a bit too strained as she inquired, a bit too cautious, a little too controlled, and without a knowing little smile, he held out the packet to her. "Go ahead," he said in a light, almost playful tone, as if he was taking in more than he ought to, as if he had been anticipating this very moment. "Crack it open." She paused for only a moment. Her eyes darted to my father as her fingers hovered over the envelope, seeking some silent reassurance or indication that everything was still under control. My father, however, remained silent, remained motionless, didn't respond, simply narrowed his eyes, clenched his jaw, and held his posture rigidly as he gazed at Matt. His expression showed the first signs of uneasiness, as if he had finally realized that something wasn't quite right. My mother opened the envelope slowly and carefully, as though she was afraid the contents would burn her fingers. She reached inside, retrieved the papers, unfolded them, skimmed the first few lines, and then her whole body froze. Her breath caught in her throat, her mouth parted slightly, and her fingers gripped the papers tightly as if she needed to physically hold on to something, as if she needed an anchor to keep the ground from shifting underfoot. I watched as the color faded from her face. My father took a step forward, grabbing the papers, his gaze flitting over the text, his face growing gloomier by the moment. I could see the muscles in his neck straining under the weight of whatever he was reading, because his jaw was clenched so tightly. "What on earth is this?" In the end, he spoke in a sharp, low voice that sounded dangerously close to panic. With his arm draped casually around my waist and his confidence so effortless that it made my mother's hands shake as she held the papers, Matt leaned back slightly, totally relaxed. She made a thin, bloodless line with her lips. "It's legal," Matt said with ease. There was hardly any hint of amusement in his voice. "Notarized, sealed, and signed." My mother's throat bobbed as she swallowed weeks ago, and her fingers shook a little as she read the words again, as though reading them again would alter their meaning. It reads, "Every wedding gift given to Lisa and me, including all monetary gifts, is legally ours, and any attempt to withhold, redirect, or otherwise interfere with those funds will be considered theft and subject to prosecution," Matt added in a calm, deliberate tone. relishing every moment of this. I was shocked that my father didn't suffer whiplash when his head snapped up so quickly. Disbelief, anger, and a dangerously near fearful look burned in his eyes. "You wouldn't." With her fingers clenched around the papers and her breath coming in short, irregular gasps, my mother whispered, her voice hardly audible. Matt grinned broadly, his assurance unflinching, his hold on my waist slightly more solid. He was beside me, a solid, unshakable force that my parents had never seen coming. "Oh, I would," he said, his voice calm, almost bored, like this was nothing more than a business transaction, like he had done this 1,000 times before, like this wasn't the first time he had dealt with people who thought they could take from him and get away with it. My mother let out a shaky breath, looking up at me now, really looking at me like she had finally realized that I wasn't the quiet, obedient daughter she had always relied on. Like she had finally noticed that I wasn't the same girl who had spent years letting them take and take and take and take without ever pushing back, and then not delivered the final blow. The words that made my mother's hands tremble, the words that made my father's expression darken, the words that sealed their absolute and utter defeat. "If you try to take $0, oh, one from us," he said, his voice so smooth, so deadly calm, so utterly confident. "We will see you in court." And just like that, the game was over. The silence that followed Matt's words was thick, suffocating, heavy with something I had never felt before, a shift, a crack in their carefully constructed reality. A moment where, for the first time in their lives, my parents and Rebecca were not in control. My mother was still gripping the legal papers, her fingers trembling around the edges, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, her brain clearly scrambling, desperate to find a way out of this, desperate to twist the situation back in her favor, desperate to regain the upper hand she had never once considered losing. She stammered, at first a mess of half-formed words and gasping breaths, her voice cracking under the weight of her own shock, her eyes darting between Matt and me like she couldn't decide who to direct her pleas toward. "Lisa, sweetheart, you don't have to take this so seriously," she finally managed, her voice a little too high, a little too forced, a little too frantic. "This is just a misunderstanding, really. Just a little family disagreement. We weren't going to keep all of it. Just a portion. Just enough to help Rebecca get back on her feet. Just enough to do exactly what I said you weren't allowed to do." I interrupted, my voice calm, steady, unshaken, my heart pounding in my chest, but my face giving away nothing. My body completely still as I watched her squirm. "To take money that doesn't belong to you, to steal from me and call it helping Rebecca, to rob your own daughter on her wedding day." Her breath hitched, her eyes widening, her lips pressing together like she had to physically stop herself from snapping back. Like she finally realized that the tone she had always used to manipulate me wasn't going to work this time. "Story 3, Kira," Marjorie Thompson declared. "We're restructuring your position after 15 years with TechVantage." There was a scarcely disguised sense of delight in her voice. Both she and Denise from HR wore well-crafted expressions of corporate regret as they sat across from me in the tiny conference room. "The business is taking a different course," Denise added, pushing a manila folder across the table. "Although we appreciate your efforts, the research division will now be a part of the product development team." I gave a contemplative nod. The typical severance deal would be to accept the files without examining it. Continuing health coverage for 3 months, 2 weeks for each year of service, and a list of resources for career counseling that I would never use. "I absolutely understand." My voice was firm as I answered. These choices are never simple. Their cheeks lit up with relief. Clearly, they had anticipated protests, tears, or rage. I was, after all, a 55-year-old woman being forced out of the IT sector, which valued youth above expertise. They were unaware that I had been looking forward to this day for weeks, ever since a misdirected email thread showed up in my inbox last month. "We want you to clear your desk by Friday," Marjorie added, feeling more assured after my seeming approval. "Before you depart, we will require your phone, laptop, company, and keycard. We'll notify your team this afternoon. My team consists of 6 outstanding engineers that I personally selected and trained over the years. More than 40% of Fortune 500 firms utilize TechVantage's main product, AccountSphere accounting software, which was developed by the same team that had assisted me in creating the distributed processing algorithm. Naturally, I said, getting up from my seat. What else is there? They looked at one another, obviously taken aback by my poise. Marjorie was the first to recover. For now, that's all. I appreciate how professional you made this. I passed the conference room with the glass walls where the executive team was meeting on my way back to my office. I could see CEO Victor Lawson making enthusiastic gestures at a PowerPoint presentation called Q3 Revenue Projections through the glass barrier. At last year's industry convention, Victor Lawson claimed to have invented my method, although he just mentioned me as a member of our research team. I locked my office door and got out my personal phone, sending a single text message. It's occurring. My last day is Friday. The answer was prompt. Perfect time. Contracts are prepared. We'll finalize the specifics over dinner tonight. I grinned as I looked at the calendar on my desk. It was Wednesday today. I would depart Tech Vantage for the final time on Friday and return on Monday. It would be interesting on Monday. Gregory Sullivan, the CEO of Precision Systems Tech, Vantage's biggest rival, and I met him that evening at Meridian, a classy eatery not far from Tech Vantage's offices. Greg realized the significance of prudence. He'd arranged a quiet eating nook in the rear, concealed from prying eyes by exquisite Japanese screens. After we gave the order, Greg shook his head and stated, "They really did it. I thought they may." However, Victor never recognized what I had truly done, cutting the very person who had invented their fundamental technology. I sipped my water and answered. He observed the underlying architecture, the user interface, and the marketing possibilities. To him, that was merely technical information. The irony was almost too perfect. I found out 3 months ago that TechVantage's legal staff had never submitted the patent application for my distributed processing technique, as they had promised to have done when I asked. They had promised to take care of it right away, but something about their response felt strange. So I looked into the company's internal records. I discovered it, at that point, an outline of the corporation's approach to claim the algorithm as a technology produced by the company without naming the creator. Prior to obtaining the patent, they had intended to force me out. Knowing intellectual property generated by workers traditionally belonged to the corporation, TechVantage was unaware that I had previously been utilizing my own tools and working on algorithmic improvements on my own time. My employment agreement did not cover such upgrades, which resulted in a 43% boost in processing efficiency. Last month, I discreetly submitted a patent application in my own name, complete with development logs and timestamps that amply demonstrated the work was done outside of business hours. Thanks to Greg's referral to a premier IP lawyer, the patent was awarded very quickly. Greg added, "All the paperwork is finalized," and he moved a folder across the table. Precision Systems formally obtains exclusive license rights to your invention. As soon as you sign, you are announced as our new Chief Innovation Officer in a press release that is sent out Monday morning. Even though I had previously committed the important concepts to memory, I carefully went over the paperwork. Continuous royalties from all goods, a 7-figure signing bonus, and significant equity and Precision Systems, using my algorithm. When Victor realizes what has transpired, how do you think his face will appear? Unable to conceal his delight at the possibility, Greg inquired. I said, "I'm more worried about my team. They have no right to be affected by the consequences." Greg nodded, having previously been spoken to. "If any of the 6 are interested, we have opportunities available for them. Senior positions with large pay increases." In one graceful motion, I closed the folder and signed the last page. Greg raised his glass and remarked, "I had secured my future, protected my team, and ensured from my work to new beginnings." He also emphasized the importance of self-worth. I clinked my glass on his and said, Thursday and Friday went in a whirlwind of exit interviews, knowledge transfer sessions, and saying farewell to colleagues. Throughout, I remained composed and professional. In the halls, administrative helpers looked at me sympathetically, even as rumors circulated across the organization. Awkwardly, junior coders came up and asked if I could give them recommendations on LinkedIn before I departed. I took careful notes on everything, every procedure, password, and project. I was fully aware that TechVantage would quickly realize how meticulous they need me to be. It wasn't kind of me to leave detailed transition notes. It was proof. Proof that, in contrast to the firm, I had operated in good faith. Denise from HR mechanically went through the normal checklist for my last leaving interview on Friday afternoon. She pushed a non-disclosure agreement across the table and said, "You understand that any intellectual property developed during your employment remains the property of TechVantage." Naturally, I gave a polite response. Anything that came about while I was working. I highlight those criteria a little using corporate resources during company time. However, you confirm that you do not own copies of confidential corporate data, and Denise was too preoccupied with ticking boxes to notice. Nothing that belongs to TechVantage has been taken by me. Sincerely, I can attest that the patent was actually mine. Along with the coffee cup my staff had given me for Christmas last year, I was packing up personal belongings from my desk, family pictures, and a collection of conference badges commemorating 15 years of industry events. Marjorie dropped by, leaning phonily casually against my doorframe. She said, "I just wanted to make sure everything is okay for your departure." Observing me as I put things in a cardboard box. "Very clear," I responded while putting a modest prize I had won for the algorithm at the heart of my plans. I gently sandwiched it between layers of tissue paper, not missing the irony. "These decisions about restructuring are never personal, Kira. Victor believes the business should take a more young approach," Marjorie added. I raised my head and looked her in the eye. "I fully comprehend. Business is business." She hesitated for a second because of something in my voice. A look of uncertainty crossed her face, but she brushed it off. "What might a 55-year-old lady who would soon lose her job do? Are you going to take a vacation?" she inquired. Her voice had a fake sense of worry. I said, "Actually, I already have something lined up. On Monday, I begin." "Oh," her expression changed to one of surprise. "That's quick. Is there anything intriguing?" I grinned broadly. "A position of leadership. I'm really looking forward to that." She gave an involuntary nod, already shifting her thoughts to other topics. "Good luck with that, then." Keycard in hand, personal items in tow, I left TechVantage's glass headquarters. For the last time, I paused to gaze back at the structure where I had worked for 15 years. I could see that the executive conference room on the top floor was lighted up for an evening meeting, perhaps to discuss how to divide up my duties among younger, less experienced, and far less costly employees. They had no idea that the identical space would be used for an emergency crisis meeting less than 72 hours later. It was a clear and bright Monday morning. I put on my new charcoal suit, a power outfit I had bought just for this day, and dressed carefully. At precisely 7:30 a.m., the Precision Systems town car pulled in, so that I could begin my first day as Chief Innovation Officer at their headquarters, Greg told me, as I settled into my new corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows. That the press release went up at 7 a.m. Already, industry newsletters are noticing it. The communications team is keeping an eye on responses. The announcement had been carefully planned out. Precision Systems hires Dr. Kira Jennings, the creator of the ground-breaking processing algorithm, as its Chief Innovation Officer and obtains the exclusive rights to it. It described how Precision Systems would be incorporating the algorithm into their next product line, highlighted my history, and highlighted my position as the exclusive creator of the patented invention. Most significantly, it made it very evident that any business utilizing the technology now would have to work with Precision Systems to negotiate future license deals. Exactly at 9:15 a.m. The first text message from my old TechVantage crew lighted up my phone. "This place is in total disarray. What did you do?" Miguel, my main developer, sent it. I typed back with a smile. "Examine your personal email. There are offers waiting for all 6 of you." Meanwhile, the planned Monday morning executive meeting at TechVantage headquarters, 8 miles away, was taking a significant turn. Miguel's play-by-play updates indicated that Victor had arrived at the office throughout the morning to find the chief financial officer and general counsel of the company waiting at his door. By 9:30 a.m., the industry announcement had arrived in both inboxes simultaneously, causing both of them to get pale. An emergency crisis session had developed out of what should have been a regular beginning of week meeting. Members of the board were making distant calls. The legal team was frantically going over the paperwork related to the algorithm's development, as well as my employment contract. Miguel said that every file that has your name on it is being pulled. All of the research division's servers were just wheeled in for analysis by the tech team. I had a perfect mental image of Victor pacing the conference room and asking Marjorie and the legal department to explain himself. The news would already be causing the stock to react. The announcement had generated a great deal of uncertainty, which investors detested. At 10:45 a.m., I received an email from Victor himself. I could almost feel the anguish coming from my computer. "There seems to be a miscommunication, Kira. Kindly give me a call as soon as possible to talk." Without replying, I sent it to the legal team at Precision Systems. By midday, speculation was rife in the industry. TechVantage's shares had plummeted 7% since the market started, whereas Precision Systems had experienced a 12% boost. I was asked to do interviews with 3 separate technology newspapers regarding the strategic coup that rocked the accounting software market. "How do you feel?" Greg inquired. I was getting comfortable when I stopped by my workplace. "Verified?" I answered honestly. 15 years of watching others take credit for my work, of being told I should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. And now, at last, acknowledgement. At the door came my new executive assistant, Dr. Jennings. "The development team is ready for you in the main meeting room." She paused as well. "The CEO of TechVantages has made several calls in the past hour. Please let him know I'm in meetings all day." Calmly, I answered. "Later this week, I'll ask our legal team to get in touch to go over licensing possibilities." My phone buzzed with another Miguel update as I was on my way to my first meeting as Chief Innovation Officer. "The board just called an emergency meeting. Victor looks like he's going to burst. P.S. My team and I accept your offer. When can we start?" By Tuesday morning, the entire impact of my leaving had been evident to everyone at TechVantage. Their flagship product account, Sphere, depended exclusively on my algorithm to analyze the huge data sets that provided it an edge over competitors without licensing rights to my invention. They faced 2 equally unpleasant alternatives: negotiate with Precise Systems or rewrite their fundamental technology from start, a process that would take years and millions in development expenditures. "Victor has called an all-hands meeting at 2 p.m. Miguel texted. It was his last day at TechVantage. He and the rest of my former team would be starting at Precision Systems next Monday. There are rumors that they will attempt to sue you. I sent our legal department his mail, and they got back to me nearly right away. Give it a go. Your documentation is flawless. Development logs, timestamps, personal equipment usage, all clearly established. We are ready for this situation." In the meantime, I was adapting to my new position remarkably well. The respect I received at Precision Systems was a stark contrast to my final years at TechVantage. People genuinely listened to me when I spoke in meetings. My ideas weren't repackaged by male colleagues and presented as their own. My age and experience were viewed as assets rather than liabilities. "The engineering team is implementing your efficiency enhancements." During our afternoon briefing, Greg told me, "Even better than we anticipated. Early testing reveals a 51% performance gain." I had numerous modifications I never shared with TechVantage. When I learnt they were going to remove me from my position, I confessed, I didn't see the need to give them my best effort. "Our gain, their loss." Greg smiled in satisfaction as he answered, "In relation to that, this morning we received the first licensing inquiry. Not from TechVantage yet. They're still in denial, but from Data Flow Systems. They fear that they may be caught in the crossfire." Miguel submitted a thorough report on Victor's all-hands meeting at 3:30 p.m. There was a noticeable sense of unease in the meeting despite the CEO's attempts to seem confident by promising the employees that TechVantage will forcefully defend our unique technology. Sensing the company's vulnerability, a number of workers had already modified their LinkedIn pages. When someone inquired directly if they had failed to acquire the patent, Marjorie appeared to be on the verge of fainting. Miguel wrote. After that, Victor ended the question period. The fallout from the industry had worsened by Wednesday. Precision Systems has received 2 significant clients that wanted to move away from account Sphere, worried that TechVantages won't be able to continue producing the product without the algorithm developer. As TechVantages continued to fall, our stock had increased by an additional 8%. I received a call from Denise in HR, the same lady who had pushed my severance payout across the table just days previously. "Kira," she said in a cautiously formal tone, "I'm phoning to talk about the state of your patent. We think that ownership rights may have been misunderstood. Calmly, I said, I don't think there's any misunderstanding. Intellectual property created on my own time, as stated explicitly in my job agreement. I'm still using my own resources. The patent paperwork verifies exactly that. Victor was hoping you may consider coming in to explore possibilities. Any discussions would need to go through Precision Systems' legal department now, I answered. They would undoubtedly be pleased to schedule a meeting to go over the conditions of the license. The other end's silence said a lot. Denise sighed at last. I'll pass that along. That afternoon, I led my first official presentation to Precision Systems' board of directors, explaining our technological plan, centered around my algorithm. Greg gave me an encouraging nod as I stood boldly at the front of the table, not tucked up in the back as I had been at TechVantage. By Friday, just 1 week after I had walked out of TechVantage for the last time, the firm was entered full crisis mode. Major investors expressed alarm as their shares dropped 23% since Monday's opening bell. Speculative articles like Can TechVantage survive the algorithm crisis were being published by industry analysts, and how a software titan might lose money due to a single strategic error. Everything. I found out via my contacts in the industry that Victor had finally told the board how serious the issue was. TechVantage would have to either rebuild account spiral without utilizing any of the technology covered by my patent, or license my algorithm from Precision Systems at astronomical prices that would destroy their profit margins. Miguel told me on our Friday video call that they had begun hiring for a new development team, as we talked about his impending move to Precision Systems. In 6 months, Victor says, they can replicate the capabilities. I couldn't contain my laughter. Even with my deep understanding of the issue space, it took me 3 years to perfect the initial algorithm. Exactly, Miguel agreed. Nobody's believing the timeline, especially after your team posted their resignation letter simultaneously. The loss of information is enormous. That afternoon, TechVantage's attorneys finally reached out to Precision Systems to open a dialogue about potential licensing arrangements. Our legal staff responded with conditions that were technically fair but strategically unpleasant, adhering to the plan we had devised. 3 times the standard industry licensing rate, plus a public acknowledgement of my role as the technology's inventor. They'll balk at the acknowledgement more than the cost. Greg predicted as we reviewed the response in his office, Victor's ego won't allow him to admit he pushed out the person who created their core technology. They will then need to reconstruct. Every day they spend attempting to duplicate my work is another day, I answered. We extend our lead in the market. 10 days after my abrupt termination, on Monday morning, I presided over the first meeting of my newly formed innovation team, which comprised Miguel and the other 5 TechVantage engineers. The energy in the room was electric as we plotted my algorithm's further development. One of my former teammates at TechVantage, Anita, said, "This is how development meetings should be." We spent half our time teaching simple principles to executives who wouldn't listen anyhow. That's what separates being viewed as replaceable from being valued. I replied, "Here, your expertise is recognized." As we ended off the excellent session, my helper showed up at the door. A big thing has happened with TechVantage, Dr. Jennings. Their board recently announced an emergency leadership change. Victor Lawson is leaving his position, effective immediately. The word got out fast. The board of TechVantages had reportedly lost faith in Victor's leadership after the patent overlook that jeopardized the company's key product. According to industry newspapers, within hours, Marjorie Thompson was also out, along with the head of legal, who had failed to properly secure the patent. Richard Donovan, the recently appointed temporary CEO of TechVantages, sent me an unexpected email that evening. Unlike Victor's desperate message from the previous week, this one was straightforward and respectful. "Dr. Jennings, congratulations on your new position. I was brought in to assist TechVantage in handling the current circumstance. A reasonable license agreement for your patented technology is something I would want to talk about. We're ready to officially recognize your achievements and make the necessary corrections for the mistakes made by the previous administration. Is it possible for us to meet next week?" I added a brief note and forwarded the email to Greg. "The first phase is finished." His response was prompt, beautifully executed. "The board is celebrating your first major victory for Precision Systems. It appears like TechVantage is at last taking a costly lesson about appreciating entrepreneurs and innovation. 3 months after my departure from TechVantage, I sat on the stage at the National Technology Innovation Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. Many of the technology journalists, industry leaders, and aspiring developers in the audience were already familiar with my story. With great pleasure, I now present our keynote speaker. The conference organizer announced, the distributed processing algorithm developed by Dr. Kira Jennings, Chief Innovation Officer of Precision Systems, has transformed data handling in several sectors. There was a lot of applause. I was walking towards the podium. A few months could have a big impact. Last year, I had attended the same conference as part of the TechVantage delegation, sat in the back as Victor made a presentation about his company's advances. Thank you. I started looking around at the focused faces. Today, I want to talk about innovation, ownership, and the importance of properly valuing intellectual contributions, regardless of where they come from. In addition to discussing the specifics of my algorithm's technical features, I also touched on the more general concerns of respect and recognition in the technological industry. Without specifically bringing up TechVantage, I stress how crucial it is for businesses to safeguard its innovators rather than regard them as expendable assets. Afterward, during the reception, numerous young women engineers approached me, asking guidance and mentorship. Just under 31 of them confided, "Your narrative altered the way I record my work. On my own time, I began to keep thorough records of my development process. Wise," I said, "your inventions should be safeguarded." As the evening concluded, I checked my phone to find an industry news alert. Finally, TechVantage acknowledged me by name as the algorithm designer and announced the license arrangement with Precision Systems. Their stock had steadied, but at a substantially lower valuation than before my departure. 1 year to the day after being forced to clean off my desk, I sat in my large office at Precision Systems, perusing the quarterly innovation report. Under my direction, the business launched 3 ground-breaking products based on my algorithm, overtaking rivals like TechVantage in terms of market share. A knock at my door interrupted my analysis. It was Greg holding a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. He placed the glasses on my desk and wished me a happy anniversary. The board wanted me to communicate the news with you directly before the public release. For the first time in the company's existence, Precision Systems has formally overtaken TechVantage in terms of market capitalization. I grinned with a sense of peaceful contentment rather than victory. That's what happens when you appreciate innovation appropriately. My helper brought over a neat envelope as Greg poured the champagne. Inside was an invitation to speak at Women in Technology's annual leadership summit. The topic, owning your intellectual value, how proper documentation revolutionized an industry. Observing the invitation, Greg remarked, "You know, you've become something of an icon." The story of the CEO who didn't understand what she had until it was gone has become a cautionary tale in business boardrooms. Richard Donovan, who had remained as TechVantage's CEO after the crisis, had implemented sweeping changes in how the company recognized and rewarded innovation. Their new policies on intellectual property protection and inventor recognition were reportedly modeled after the program I had established at Precision Systems. "It was never about retribution," I replied, lifting my glass in a toast. "It has to do with recognition, about demonstrating to the sector that innovation is not a nameless process. It originates from actual people who should be given due credit and acknowledgement." As the afternoon sun shone through the windows of my office, Greg affirmed this while clinking his glass against mine. I thought back on my path. I had finally discovered what had eluded me throughout my career. At the age of 56, not only achievement, but recognition. The algorithm that had transformed an industry was now permanently linked to my name, where it belonged.